Linda Miller was 61, a widow, and for decades she had been the kind of woman who didn't allow herself to break down in public. She founded and maintained a textile empire that eventually became worth tens of millions. But that morning, sitting alone in an apartment near her company's headquarters, luxury offered her no comfort. Her coffee grew cold in the cup, and the silence was so heavy it seemed to fill the space. It wasn't the sadness of an ordinary day. It was an old, accumulated feeling that had been growing since her husband's death. Linda had lived to work, to provide, to prevent her 3 children from experiencing the hardship she had endured as a child. And yet, in that precise moment, she felt something akin to shame, as if it were absurd for her to expect affection in return for a lifetime of dedication. The telephone was the first thing to break the silence, and it did so almost mechanically. Jessica, the eldest, called bluntly. She didn't ask how her mother was, whether she had slept well or if she had eaten breakfast. She simply explained a problem with the renovation of their mansion, a house bought and decorated with money Linda had contributed without asking for anything in return, and requested an immediate transfer. Linda answered with her usual calm, but when she hung up, she was left with that familiar feeling of being useful only when she solves something. Shortly after, Michael, the prestigious surgeon, sent a short, polite message asking for help to cover an office expense. Nothing more. And then, by contrast, a cruel clarity dawned on her. Daniel, the youngest, was the only one who called without asking for anything, just to find out if she had eaten or if she was feeling too lonely. In her office, looking out at the city from the window, Linda understood something that hurt her more than any financial loss. She had raised successful children, but emotionally empty ones, and she herself had unwittingly fostered that model. That day wasn't like any other. Linda tried to work, review reports, answer emails, but her mind wouldn't cooperate. Every number on the screen seemed empty, irrelevant. It was then that, without making a big deal out of it, she began to mentally review the last few years and noticed a pattern impossible to ignore. Jessica's visits always coincided with some material need. Michael only appeared when something went wrong in his career. There were no spontaneous calls, no real presence. And the hardest part was accepting that it wasn't explicit malice, but rather habit. Jessica had always been available, always solving problems, always covering for her. She had never set boundaries. She had never demanded time, a listening ear, affection. In that same office where she had made decisions that affected the lives of thousands of employees, Linda realized that she had never made a firm, emotional decision as a mother. It wasn't an impulse or a sudden outburst. The idea began as an uncomfortable question that haunted her for hours. If I had nothing tomorrow, who would still see me as a mother? The question frightened her because of its extreme nature, but it also captivated her. Linda knew perfectly well the power of money in human relationships because she had seen it in business partners, suppliers, and even friends. That afternoon, alone, without telling anyone, she decided to do something she knew many would judge as madness. Not to punish, not for revenge, but to confirm a truth she already sensed. She planned to disappear from her comfortable life for a few days and present herself to her own children as someone who had lost everything. No company, no property, no status. Just an older woman, tired and vulnerable, knocking on doors. At that moment, without tears or speeches, Linda crossed an internal line. She stopped wanting to believe and began needing to verify. The transition wasn't elegant or quick. Linda didn't warn anyone, left no notes or explanations. That same night, she opened her closet and chose the simplest clothes she owned, old garments she no longer wore and would never have worn to a meeting. She left jewelry, documents, and cards in a safe and went out with a light backpack, as if she were committing a silent act against her own life. The first impact was physical. The cold of the street is unlike anything you feel from a window. She walked aimlessly for hours, truly hungry, her body tense, learning to lower her gaze so as not to attract attention. No one recognized her. No one asked who she was. In a few hours, she went from being an influential woman to someone completely invisible, and that invisibility hurt more than she had imagined. Sitting on a park bench, her hands numb and her stomach empty, Linda understood why so many people become invisible to the world. No one wants to see someone else's vulnerability. If you're reading this far, it might make you uncomfortable, but that's part of why I'm telling you everything. If this story is stirring something within you, take a second to leave a like, comment on where you're reading from, or share it. Not for me, but because these stories are usually lived in silence. That night, Linda didn't sleep. She simply watched as people walked by without noticing her, how respect vanishes when appearances change. At dawn, tired and ashamed of herself for having underestimated what she was doing, she decided it was time to knock on the first door. Jessica's, not as a businesswoman, not as a provider, but as a mother who, at least on the surface, no longer had anything to offer. Getting to Jessica's house was more difficult than Linda had expected, not because of the distance, but because of what it represented. That mansion was a symbol of everything she had built for her children: security, status, comfort. Linda looked at her reflection in a window before ringing the doorbell and barely recognized herself. Her hair was disheveled, her clothes worn, and weariness etched on her face. When Jessica opened the door, the reaction was immediate and painful. There was no genuine surprise or concern. There was discomfort. Jessica glanced around before speaking, as if afraid a neighbor might witness the scene. Linda tried to explain in simple terms that she had lost the company, that she had nowhere to stay. She didn't ask for money, just a place to sit, to talk. The response wasn't a direct no, it was worse, a series of excuses, short phrases, and physical distance. Jessica didn't raise her voice or act outright cruelty, but every gesture made it clear that her mother was a problem who didn't belong there. She said it wasn't a good time, that the children might be frightened, that the neighbors talked too much. She suggested a cheap hotel, a shelter, something temporary, as if Linda were an unwelcome guest. She never once hugged her, never once invited her in. Linda felt something she had never felt before, whether with a business partner or an enemy: pure shame. Not because of her appearance, but because she understood that, in this place built with her money, there was no longer room for her outside of her role as benefactor. When the door closed, Linda didn't cry. She walked slowly to the corner, her chest tight, accepting a brutal truth. To her eldest daughter, who lacked status, she didn't exist as a mother, only as a threat to the perfect image she had cultivated. The drive to Michael's clinic was short, but Linda felt it dragged on. Unlike Jessica's house, this building was public, crowded, and yet she felt just as exposed. She waited, sitting with her backpack between her feet, watching well-dressed patients, hurried doctors, and receptionists who avoided eye contact. When Michael appeared, her surprise lasted barely a second. There was no hug, no physical contact. He kept a calculated distance, as if afraid someone might associate that image with his name. Linda spoke calmly, explaining that she had lost everything, that she had nowhere to stay. Michael listened, but his attention was divided. He glanced at his watch, lowered his voice, and surveyed his surroundings. He asked her to wait a moment and disappeared into his office. He returned with a folded bill in his hand, $50. He held it out like someone fulfilling a basic obligation and began justifying it before Linda could even react. He spoke of personal boundaries, of reputation, of how complicated his job was. He said he couldn't mix things up. He didn't offer a sofa, a shower, or a hot meal, just money, quick, clean, without emotional commitment. Linda silently accepted the bill, not out of need, but because she understood that this was the maximum humanity her son was willing to offer her in that state. As she left, she felt something other than sadness, a kind of moral exhaustion. Michael hadn't rejected her completely, but he had reduced her to a manageable nuisance. At that moment, Linda understood that. For two of her children, love had very clear conditions, and none of them included vulnerability. The walk to Daniel's house was different from the start. There were no imposing buildings or automatic gates, just simpler streets, and a neighborhood where people still greeted each other. Linda walked slowly, her body tired and her mind heavy with everything she had experienced in just a few hours. Daniel had always been the different son, the one who chose to teach instead of pursuing prestige, the one who never asked for large sums of money, the one who was treated as the least successful at family gatherings. Linda carried a silent guilt because of it. She herself had compared, praised material achievements, looked down on the modest life he led with Sarah. Before ringing the doorbell, she hesitated. Not out of fear of rejection, but because she no longer knew if she could bear to confirm that there was no place for her there either. If you've read this far, you can probably imagine the weight of that moment. Sometimes you keep going only because there's no turning back. If this story is resonating with you, leave a comment saying where you're reading from, or share it with someone who might understand this kind of familial silence. Linda rang the doorbell without announcing who it was. Daniel opened the door and, upon seeing her, didn't ask anything first. He didn't assess her clothes or her appearance. He simply said her name and let her in. Sarah appeared behind her, surprised, but not uncomfortable. In less than a few minutes, Linda had a plate of hot food in her hands, a clean towel, and someone telling her to sit down and relax. No one asked how she had gotten to that point. No one demanded explanations. In that small, unpretentious house, Linda felt something she hadn't felt in years, that her presence wasn't a problem. The night unfolded in a way Linda wasn't prepared to process. After dinner, Daniel showed her the bathroom, gave her clean clothes they had set aside without comment, and told her she could sleep in the bed. Linda tried to refuse, out of habit, out of embarrassment, but Daniel was firm in a calm way, without being overbearing. He said there was no discussion, that she would rest there. Sarah, meanwhile, tidied the kitchen as if it were the most natural thing in the world. No one questioned her. No one asked for details. Linda went to bed tense, but with a sense of security she hadn't felt in years. The silence in that house wasn't cold. It was human. There were no luxuries, but there was care. In the early hours of the morning, Linda woke to a soft murmur. It wasn't a dream. From her bedroom, she could hear Daniel and Sarah talking in the kitchen, thinking she was fast asleep. They weren't talking about recriminations or doubts. They were discussing bills, how to stretch their monthly income, what they could sell if necessary. Sarah casually suggested they could sell their wedding rings if the situation dragged on. Daniel didn't hesitate. They agreed that she would be fine, that they would figure things out later. Linda lay motionless, her eyes open, feeling a knot in her chest that wasn't pain, but shame mixed with gratitude. For the first time, she understood that true love isn't announced, justified, or negotiated. It simply takes responsibility. When dawn broke, Linda was no longer the same woman who had left her apartment the day before. Not because she had learned something new about the world, but because she had confirmed something painful about her own family. She got up before Daniel and Sarah, sat at the small kitchen table, and stared at her hands. She thought about all the money she had given away without a second thought. about the times she had solved other people's problems as if it were her natural duty, about how she had confused providing with being present. She hadn't slept well, but she didn't want to. She felt a mixture of relief and sadness that was hard to explain. Relief at knowing that true love existed in her life. Sadness for having ignored it for so long, for having underestimated it simply because it didn't come wrapped in success or social recognition. It was then that she decided the test had to end, not out of exhaustion, but because she'd seen enough. She discreetly called her lawyer from the bathroom, using a phone she'd kept hidden since the beginning. She didn't give many details, only asking him to bring the necessary documents and contact Jessica and Michael so they could appear later that day. Linda felt neither euphoria nor a desire for punishment. She felt a strange, almost oppressive serenity. Daniel and Sarah woke up shortly after, and seeing her sitting there, Sarah offered her more coffee as if it were the most natural thing in the world. Linda thanked her, knowing that whatever happened next, that gesture had already defined who they truly were. The atmosphere shifted completely when the lawyer arrived. Daniel stood up from the sofa, frowning, clearly confused, while Sarah stood motionless by the door, unsure of what was happening. Linda took a deep breath before speaking. She didn't launch into a long speech or try to be dramatic. She said, her voice firm but weary, that she had never lost the company, that nothing she had said the day before was true. She explained that it had been a test, something she needed to do to understand the state of her relationships as a mother. Daniel didn't react with immediate anger. His first thought was to ask if she was all right. Sarah sat silently, processing the information without raising her voice. Linda noticed this detail. Neither of them asked about money, inheritances, or rewards. They simply wanted to understand why she had gone to such extremes. Shortly after, Jessica and Michael arrived almost simultaneously, summoned urgently but without explanation. Surprise was evident when they saw Linda, clean and composed, sitting with a confident posture, accompanied by a lawyer. An awkward atmosphere filled the room. Linda didn't raise her voice or point fingers. She simply recounted with concrete facts what had happened the day before. She described how she had been received by each of them, without exaggerating or softening anything. Jessica tried to justify herself by talking about stress and situations beyond her control. Michael spoke of boundaries and responsibilities. Neither denied what had happened. And there lay the harshest truth. They hadn't failed. By not recognizing their mother, but by not seeing her as someone who deserved care when she no longer represented status or utility. Linda looked at them with a calmness she had never possessed before and understood that this moment wasn't for shouting, but for shattering an illusion. Linda listened to each attempt at explanation without interrupting, but inside she wasn't arguing anymore. She felt no anger, not even disappointment in the classic sense. She felt something drier. Acceptance. Acceptance that she had raised adults who were functional in the eyes of the world, but fragile in what truly mattered. When she finished speaking, she made it clear that she wasn't there to humiliate them or settle scores in that moment. She told them that the pain hadn't been in the outright rejection, but in the ease with which they had prioritized their own comfort over their mother's. Daniel remained silent, visibly uncomfortable with the tension, and Sarah looked at Linda with a mixture of respect and sadness, as if she understood the weight of what was happening without needing any further words. It was then that Linda mentioned what she had overheard the night before. Not accusing, simply recounting. She spoke of the alliances, the hushed conversation, the decision made without hesitation. The effect was immediate. Jessica lowered her gaze. Michael froze, speechless. Daniel reacted with embarrassment, trying to downplay it, but Linda stopped him with a gentle gesture. She said, She wasn't telling the story to expose them, but because that gesture had defined everything. In a small house, with no resources to spare, she had found more humanity than in years surrounded by privilege. For the first time, Linda felt she didn't need to justify her future decisions. The evidence was there, clear and simple, and no amount of money could cover it up. Linda was clear about what would come next. She didn't talk about immediate punishments or using inheritances as a weapon. She said that, from that day forward, automatic privileges were over. There would be no more unexplained transfers, no more bought solutions to fill emotional voids. If they wanted to rebuild something with her, it would have to be from a different place. She proposed family therapy, not as a threat, but as a real condition. Community service, exposure to realities different from what they were used to, time invested without financial gain. Jessica reacted with disbelief, as if she couldn't understand why that was necessary. Michael nodded silently, uncomfortably, aware that he didn't have a solid argument to counter. Linda wasn't looking for obedience, she was looking for the truth. And for the first time, she set boundaries without feeling guilty. Sarah was the only one who spoke calmly at that moment, not to defend Daniel or attack the others, but to ask for something unexpected: time. She said that no one changes overnight, that Linda's pain was valid, but that a definitive breakup doesn't always heal. Linda listened attentively, not because she needed permission, but because she recognized a rare coherence in those words. Sarah gained nothing by asking for restraint. She wasn't defending her own interests. She was thinking of the whole. That gesture confirmed something Linda had known since the night before. Greatness has nothing to do with titles or bank accounts, but with the ability to think beyond oneself even when one has little. Linda's final gesture wasn't announced as a reward or presented as reparation. It simply happened. Days later, without cameras, speeches, or warnings to her other children, she called Daniel and Sarah to a small notary's office. There, with clear documents and without theatrics, she handed them the deed to a decent house, simple but solid, in a quiet neighborhood. She made it clear that it wasn't payment for what they had done, nor a way of putting them above anyone else. It was recognition of something that can't be bought: character. Daniel tried to protest, uncomfortable, saying it wasn't necessary, that they hadn't helped him for that reason. Linda listened and responded with a simple, almost weary phrase. That was precisely why she was doing it. Because they had chosen to care when there was nothing to gain. Because they hadn't asked how much it cost. At that moment, Linda felt that for the first time in many years, she was using her money in a way that didn't distort love. Today, as Linda writes this story and shares it in a forum like this, she doesn't do so to lecture or point fingers. She does it because that day forced her to look at herself without excuses. She understood that money can solve problems, but it can also distort relationships if used as a substitute for affection. She learned that setting boundaries isn't abandoning, and that loving doesn't always mean giving more, but giving better. Jessica and Michael are still on their journey, each at their own pace, facing discomforts they previously avoided with checks. Daniel and Sarah remain who they were without boasting or moral superiority. And Linda, for the first time in decades, sleeps with a different kind of peace. The peace of knowing who her family is when money no longer speaks for them. If this story prompts someone to ask themselves an uncomfortable question before it's too late, then it was worth telling.